He stepped onto the jet bridge with the quiet confidence of a kid who'd grown up in Manhattan's Upper East Side. 15-year-old Xavier Marshall adjusted the leather strap of his backpack, his gaze calm as he passed under the first class sign. Behind him, a line of well-heeled travelers chatted softly, their footsteps muffled by the deep pile carpeting. In this space, this sanctuary of polished chrome plush seats and champagne trolleys, every detail whispered privilege and belonging. And Xavier, ticket in hand, belonged just as much as anyone else. He paused at seat 1A. Sunlight filtered through the Owens Corning glass, painting soft patterns on the ivory leather. A discreet flight attendant arrived with a warm smile and a folded blanket. Xavier nodded his thanks, then settled in, letting the hush of the cabin wash over him. No one seemed to notice until she did. Head flight attendant Greta Svensson appeared at the far end of the cabin like a conductor taking the stage. Her crisp gray uniform was impeccable, her blonde hair coiled into the trademark bun of European Airlines. She moved with precise grace, offering "Good morning, sirs," and "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" as to first-class passengers. When her eyes caught Xavier's dark hoodie and immaculate white sneakers, so out of place among the silk scarves and bespoke suits, her expression pinched. Xavier felt the air shift before he even registered what was coming. He glanced up from his book. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart open at the same page he'd been reading since boarding, and met her cool, assessing stare. He forced a small smile, already bracing for the obstacle he knew might come. "Sir," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" He tensed. "Yes, ma'am," he replied quietly, pulling the real ticket, purchased at full price, no upgrade, no favors, from his pocket. He held it out. She took it slowly, as if examining evidence. Her icy blue eyes flicked from the name Xavier Marshall to the printed seat number 1A, then back to his face. A faint frown appeared at the corner of her mouth. "I'm going to have to verify this," she said, the words clipped. "Please come with me to the galley." Xavier's heart fluttered. Surprise, annoyance, embarrassment. In that moment, the cabin felt too small, too heavy. The passengers around him glanced up, curiosity flickering in their gazes. No one spoke. No one reached out. They simply watched. He closed his book, looked his headphones into his pocket. He froze. His steps were steady. He'd practiced his walk in prep school, but every eye seemed to move to the back of his hoodie. The champagne corn stopped as he passed. The silver flute tipped and tinkled. A woman in a jade silk suit looked away first. Then another diverted her gaze. Silence conspired against it. In the galley, the space was tight, brightness harsh. The overhead light reflected off stainless steel surfaces. Xavier felt the weight of the moment. Nothing in his 16 years had felt so public, so exposed. Greta crossed her arms, the epitome of professionalism. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a mistake," she said. "This seat is reserved for first-class fare-paying passengers. Perhaps your ticket was misprinted or mixed up." Xavier steadied himself. "This is my ticket," he said, voice even. "Seat 1A. Xavier Marshall, purchased 3 months ago." She sighed, not the soft exhale of weariness, but the sharp sound of someone imposing authority. "Well then," she said, "I'm afraid you'll have to return to business class until we can confirm." He didn't argue, he didn't shout. He just looked at her, his dark eyes clear, and said, "Yes, ma'am," with the precise courtesy she demanded. And with that, he turned and walked back through the curtain into the business cabin, each stride a steady pulse against the thrum of his own heart. As he sat down in seat 15C, farther back than any kitchen assistant's stool, Xavier's hand shook. The sting of humiliation was hot behind his eyes. He closed them for a second, recalling how he'd grown up, hearing that no one invites you to the table. You earn your seat. He was the grandson of a man whose holdings were measured in billions. Yet today, in these hushed, narrow aisles, that meant nothing. Beside him, Diana Green, his classmate at Manhattan Prep, leaned over. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice shaking with quiet anger. He managed a small, wan smile. "I'm fine," he said, but his knuckles turned wide around his phone. He watched Greta return to the first-class cabin, her back rigid, heels clicking. No one stopped her. No one challenged her. The entire cabin had chosen silence. Xavier's world narrowed to the phone screen. His thumb hovered over the silent alert icon in the airline's safety app, the kind reserved for senior executives and emergency situations. He didn't reflect on privilege now. He reflected on principle. And if no one would speak up for him, he would speak up for himself. Quietly, powerfully, and invisibly. He pressed the icon, a single tap unseen by any passenger, but destined to send a coded message to the airline's Paris control center. Back in first class, The mood shimmered as champagne glasses were refilled, seat belts fastened, and safety cards folded. But something had shifted. Unnoticed eyes flicked toward the curtain, toward the galley, toward the ceiling vents, and then back down at Xavier's empty seat in 1A. In the hush between engine roars, Xavier sat back, took a deep breath, and opened his book again. The words on the page blurred, but in his mind, a new story was unfolding, one where silence could speak louder than any argument, where dignity came not from a raised voice, but from the quiet assertion of her rights. And somewhere in the control tower at Charles de Gaulle, a signal blinked on a console. The code name Silent Alerts glowed red. The shift began. Xavier Marshall stared out the tiny oval window, watching the gray tarmac of Charles de Gaulle stretch on forever. He'd never felt smaller than he did in that moment, an island of one seat in the crowded business cabin, everyone else already settled in. He pressed the heel of his palm against his temple, fighting the throbbing behind his eyes. 15 years old shouldn't feel like 15 millennia. He drew in a slow breath, reminding himself who he was, grandson of the Marshall fortune, heir to a family office that managed over $5.1 billion in assets. He'd grown up in a townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, where marble staircases and crystal chandeliers were ordinary. Privilege wasn't new to him, but today's lesson was that privilege alone didn't guarantee respect. As he shifted in seat 15C, a flight attendant appeared at his elbow. Diana Green, his classmate from Manhattan Prep. Her soft brown hair was pulled into a loose bun. Her eyes were bright with concern. "Xavier," she whispered, crouching so her voice wouldn't carry. "Are you okay?" He forced a tight smile. "I'm fine, Diana." But his voice cracked. She placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You don't deserve that." He looked away, blinking back the sting. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what she did to dignity." Across the aisle, the curtain to first class rustled. Greta Svensson emerged, smoothing her uniform jacket with deliberate precision. Xavier's stomach clenched at the sight of her, tall, flawless, her Nordic features set in that unreadable mask of professional confidence. She looked every inch the stewardess who had spent 18 years learning how to run a cabin with an iron will. Inside first class, the cabin crew hovered around the empty seats, 1A. They adjusted pillows, refilled water glasses, and exchanged glances that betrayed an uncomfortable mix of curiosity and guilt. No one would meet Xavier's eye, even though they all knew what had happened. A 15-year-old boy slapped so hard, the echo had rung across 3 rows. Xavier took another breath, letting the noise of the jet bridge and distant announcements wash over him. He thought of home, his quiet bedroom lined with books, the framed photos of grandparents who'd taught him to walk with his head held high. He thought of his father telling him, "You earn your place in this world, X. Privilege opens doors, but character keeps them open." He'd always believed that. Today, he felt that lesson's weight. Up front, Greta's crisp voice floated back through the curtain. "Captain Hammond, I'll need you to review Seat 1A ticket verification." The name Hammond echoed in Xavier's mind. Captain Richard Hammond, 30 years of flying, a man whose thumbs had never trembled on the yoke. Even he would hesitate to challenge a 15-year-old ticket holder. Diana squeezed Xavier's hand. "I'm going to get you something to drink," she said, rising. She slipped through the cruise serving aisle and disappeared behind the curtain. Xavier closed his eyes. He could hear muffled conversation, double-checking seat assignments, the rustle of paper manifests, the clink of service carts. Business class felt like a waiting room for humiliation. Passengers politely averted their eyes, pretending nothing had happened. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast at home. He wondered if he could even swallow food right now. A voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin boarding momentarily. Please ensure all carry-ons are securely stowed." The phrase, "ladies and gentlemen," felt like a taunt. He slid his phone out of his pocket, the screen dark. The silent alert icon hovered in his thumb's range. He tapped it once when Greta slapped him, and that had launched the chain reaction. The control center lighting up, commanders in Paris consulting manifest data, senior leadership deciding this disgrace couldn't stand. But that was yet to play out. Beside him, Diana returned with a bottled water and a small wrapped sandwich. "Here." Her voice was gentle as, "Eat something." He thanked her quietly and set the sandwich on the tray table. He unwrapped the paper and took a bite. Cold chicken salad. Grateful for something familiar in the swirl of adrenaline. Diana watched him with soft concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "Words won't help." She nodded. Sometimes silence is its own statement. He thought of those words, silence as a statement. They echoed in his mind, sharper than any slap. In the galley, Greta Svensson stood with her arms crossed, speaking to Keller, the junior purser. Xavier pictured her back, perfect posture, crisp uniform. But he knew her secret. She'd built her career on assumptions, on the idea that she could decide who belonged in first class without asking questions. He fingered the edge of his seat cushion. He remembered the privilege of being invisible in classroom hallways. No one expected much of him. He flew under the radar. But here, he'd become hyper-visible. An anomaly in a hoodie and sneakers, a black boy among trimmed gray beards and silk scarves. He'd been an object lesson until he decided to be an agent of change. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling safety checks. Overhead bins clicked shut. The engines hummed to life. Xavier felt the plane's heartbeat under his feet. He looked at his watch. 5:42 a.m. Paris time. The sun was climbing above the horizon, casting a pale light through the windows. Somewhere in the bowels of the airport, alarms must have sounded on consoles as control room operators saw that silent alert code. Papers rustled, phones buzzed. A message had been dispatched. Verify incident. Seat 1A. Outbound. Report any action. Xavier exhaled slowly. He could almost feel the world tilting, a subtle shift in power. He thought of his grandfather's admonition. Never ask for applause, Xavier. Actions speak louder. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet symphony of pre-flight routine. Seatbelt chimes, muffled footsteps, the gentle murmur of engines. His heart had slowed, replaced by a steady cadence of resolve. He looked at Diana, who gave him a small nod, no words needed. Behind the curtain, he imagined the first-class cabin's high-definition screens flickered alive, revealing that one unrepeatable moment. Greta's hand connecting with his wrist. He imagined the gasps, the sudden hush, the faces paling with realization. He took another bite of sandwich, letting it anchor him in the present. The boarding door closed with a definitive thud. The pilot's voice crackled overhead. Flight 6-2, this is your final boarding call. Xavier swallowed. He sat up straighter, sliding the sandwich aside. The world outside might still be spinning on assumptions and biases, but inside him, a quiet revolution was unfolding. As the engines spooled up, he lifted his chin. He was no longer just the boy in the hoodie. He was the boy who had decided that silence would speak for him, and for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. And somewhere in that silent declaration, the plane's next move was already decided. Xavier sat up straighter as Greta Svensson's heels clicked toward him through the curtain. He had been expecting this moment. Everyone in first class had been watching, but when she paused at his row, an uneasy hush fell over even the business cabin. "Sir," she said, voice steady and low, "I need you to step back into first class for a moment." Her words sounded polite, but the insistence underneath felt like a command. Xavier closed his book, shoved his headphones into his jacket pocket, and rose. Around him, passengers shifted uncomfortably. No one volunteered a seat. No one whispered support. The soft murmur of the cabin died as all eyes turned to the narrow aisle. He met Greta's cool blue gaze without flinching. In that look, he saw every assumption she'd made, that a black teenager in a hoodie must have no right to a seat in this cabin. But Xavier had spent his life learning to hold his ground in the face of misjudgment. He offered her a calm nod. "Yes, ma'am." She extended a gloved hand toward the curtain and then paused, as though savoring the moment. "I'd like to verify your ticket and your fare, class. Please join me up front." Xavier felt a twinge of frustration, but he swallowed it. He had rights, even if she chose to ignore them. He followed her through the curtain, heart pounding, but steps steady. The crisp scent of sparkling water and polished metal greeted him as he entered first class proper. The cabin felt smaller now, more intimate. 3 rows of seats that cost more than most families' yearly incomes. Greta led him to the central aisle where a small cluster of crew members had gathered. Diana Green from business, 2 junior flight attendants, and Keller the purser, his face pinched with curiosity. They all turned as Xavier approached. No one spoke. Their silence felt heavy, like a tide pulling against him. Greta produced a small leather folder and extracted a copy of the manifest. In her gloved hand, the paper looked ominous. She scanned the list, then raised her eyes to Xavier. "I'm afraid I don't see your name under first-class fare-paying passengers. Are you traveling with a companion whose booking might include you?" Xavier kept his voice low but clear. "No, ma'am. I booked seat 1A myself 3 months ago, full fare." He tapped the ticket in his coat pocket for emphasis. "You'll see my name, Xavier Marshall, right there." Greta tilted her head as though she were puzzled by an unexpected puzzle piece. "I'm going to need you to wait here while I sort this out," she said, her tone implying he'd be much more comfortable in business class. He felt the blood rise in his ears, but he clenched his jaw. "Of course," he said. He couldn't argue with her. That would only confirm whatever notion she already held. Better to stay calm. Greta nodded curtly and slipped behind the curtain again. Xavier turned to face the first-class passengers she'd just left behind. Some avoided his gaze, others studied him like a specimen under glass. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that none of this diminished his worth. A young couple glanced at him, then exchanged worried looks. A silver-haired man in the back row gave him a gentle nod, as if apologizing for their shared silence. It was a small gesture. I spelled a while, no, but it felt like a lifeline. He stepped out into the business cabin again. He saw Diana waiting at 15D, her hand extended. She guided him to his seat without a word. He sat down, placing his ticket and boarding pass on the tray table. The napkin service paused mid-fold, and a toddler's giggle died on its lips. Xavier closed his eyes for a moment, letting the cabin's recycled air fill his lungs. He willed his heart to slow. How had it come to this? A boy who knew the value of hard work, who'd earned admission to an elite private school, reduced to a problem child in the eyes of a flight attendant. He opened his eyes and scanned the business cabin. The seats were arranged in herringbone formation, each one elegant but narrower, less forgiving. Xavier's seat, 15C, had been labeled extra legroom, but it felt cramped now. He leaned back and breathed out. Overhead, the lights dimmed. A gentle chime signaled the final boarding check. The engines murmured to life. Xavier imagined his grandfather's study, oak paneling, warm lamplight, leather-bound books, where he'd taught Xavier that dignity was a quiet thing, born of integrity, not applause. He pressed his fingertips to the armrests, grounding himself. The ticket in his lap was more than a request to travel. It was evidence of a right he wouldn't relinquish. In the galley, he caught a glimpse of Greta through the mesh of the service cart. She stood there, folded arms, and studied the business cabin with a practiced detachment. But it wasn't working anymore. Her composure looked brittle, as though one more look at him might crack it. A flight attendant wheeled a snack cart toward Xavier's row. He reached for a packaged sandwich, a small comfort, and unwrapped it. The plastic crinkled louder than usual, punctuating his thoughts. He took a bite, the taste bland but familiar. Beside him, Diana slipped into the aisle seat. She placed her water bottle on the table and offered him a half smile. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. He shrugged. "Better now." He set the sandwich aside and met her gaze. "I'd rather be here than part of a scene up there." She nodded, understanding. Her eyes were bright with solidarity. "You did the right thing by staying calm." He exhaled slowly. "Words won't help," he murmured. "They're already made up in her head." Diana's hand squeezed his. "Then let action speak." He looked at his ticket again. Xavier Marshall, first class, purchased in good faith. No loopholes, no upgrades, just his name in print, waiting to be honored. Behind the curtain, he heard muffled voices. He couldn't make out the words, but he felt the tension shift. The engines rumbled louder Xavier tucked his sandwich wrapper into the tray table slot and let his head fall back against the seat. The cabin lights dimmed further, bathing the business class in a soft glow. Overhead bins clicked closed in sequence, and the hum of the engines rose in volume, an anxious lullaby. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady the tight coil of feelings in his chest: embarrassment, anger, betrayal. He looked across the aisle at Diana, who met his eyes and offered a small, sympathetic nod. Her presence was a comfort, but she was all he had. Around them, other passengers leaned back in their seats, closing their laptops and shifting their weight, preparing for takeoff, or perhaps just settling into the shared silence that had swallowed the cabin whole. No one volunteered a kind word. No one offered to switch seats. Xavier's fingers twitched on the armrest. He imagined the first-class cabin, plush seats, champagne flutes, privacy partitions. That was his rightful place. Instead, he was here, tucked away in the less glamorous section, tucked away like a secret no one wanted to admit existed. He reached into his pocket and felt the outline of his boarding pass, a thin rectangle of paper that carried more weight than any designer label. He pulled it out and smoothed it flat on his palm. "Seat 1A," he whispered to himself. It was his proof. Yet proof meant nothing to Greta Svensson. He closed his eyes and replayed the moment again: her gloved hand, her barn owl stare, the crack of the slap. Everything had happened in a blink, but the echo had lingered. In that instant, he'd been reduced from heir apparent to interloper. He hated that feeling. He hated the way his cheeks had burned, the way his ears had rung. A flight attendant wheeled down the aisle with beverage service. Xavier accepted a cup of water, his hands still shaking enough to risk a spill. He clenched the plastic cup, feeling its give, then set it down carefully. The ice clinked. Tiny percussion in the cathedral of stillness. He opened his eyes. Across the cabin, a man in a tailored navy suit caught his glance, then looked away. A woman in a floral scarf traced the pattern on her lap with a fingertip. A child fidgeted in her mother's lap. All of them saw. All of them chose to stay mute. The attendant paused beside Xavier. "Anything else I can get you, sir?" she asked, voice hushed. He hesitated. He could ask for an apology, demand that Greta be called out, that the crew seat him back in first class. But requests would be meaningless. He'd already seen how powerless polite words could be. Instead, he shook his head. "I'm good," he said softly. Her eyebrows lifted in understanding. Then she moved on. His heart clenched with gratitude and frustration. There it was again. The empathy offered quietly in the wings, rather than boldly in the spotlight. It was safer that way for them, not for him. He closed his eyes once more and let his mind drift. He thought of the first time he'd realized what "you don't belong here" could mean. He was 7, standing in a school office while a teacher told his grandmother that his tie didn't match the uniform. He'd stayed silent then, too, just as he had today when the mistreatment was delivered publicly. He thought of his grandfather's history, a man who had flown cargo planes half a century ago, before Marshall Holdings became an empire. His grandfather had stories of strangers spitting on him at small-town tarmacs, of gate agents questioning his ticket because of the color of his skin. Back then, his grandfather had spoken up. He'd rallied pilots, flown straight to the airline Sears office. He'd forced apologies and reforms. Xavier had never heard those stories until he was old enough to understand their weight. He'd nodded respectfully, then returned to his life of privilege. But today he realized that privilege didn't shield him from prejudice. And pity, no matter how well-intentioned, didn't restore dignity. The cabin shifted abruptly as the pilot's voice came over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin taxiing to the runway. Please ensure that your tray tables are stowed, your seat backs are in the upright position, and your seat belts are securely fastened." The routine announcement felt like a countdown. Xavier tightened his belt and sat up straight. His pulse quickened as the engine spooled and the plane lurched forward. He gripped the armrest, knuckles white, and focused on the overhead vent above him. He thought of his phone in his jacket pocket, of the coded silent alert he tapped. That single action, invisible to everyone around him, was already in motion, a glowing dot on a distant console in Paris, flashing someone's attention to seat 1A. He had no way of knowing what would happen next, but he knew it would be bigger than this cabin, bigger than his humiliation. Xavier closed his eyes and let the power of that thought fill him. He was no longer just a boy stuck in the back of the plane. He was a catalyst. And that knowledge gave him a strange calm. The engines roared as they turned onto the runway. Xavier opened his eyes and watched the view outside the window. Tarmac sliding beneath the wing, the outline of terminal buildings receding. He could feel sheer speed vibrating through the frame of the plane, but inside him, everything was still. He took a slow, even breath. The flight would lift off any second now, carrying him toward New York. But he also felt the current of change flowing beneath the surface of this flight, an unseen undercurrent that would, he hoped, unmask the prejudice at its heart. A flash of movement outside caught his eye. The reflection of someone looking back into the cabin through the glass. For a moment, Xavier imagined it was Greta, peering out to see if her target was gone. But then the reflection vanished, and he was alone with his determination. The plane accelerated, pressing Xavier back into his seat. The roar crescendoed. In that moment, he felt his grandfather's spirit beside him, felt the legacy of every person who'd ever been told they didn't belong, and he knew the world might still whisper, "You don't belong," but he would not whisper back in shame. He would stand silent, unshakable, and let the world listen. As the nose lifted and the cabin pitched upward, Xavier pressed his lips together in a firm line. He was ready. Because sometimes the tension before the climb is where you find your true altitude. Xavier sat back in his seat as the plane climbed through the cloud layer, the hull vibrating with steady thrust. Around him, the business cabin settled into routine bustle. Tray tables clicked into place, murmured conversations drifted, and flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency. But for Xavier, every sound was muffled by the storm inside his head. He pressed his fingers to his temples, trying to quell the pounding there. The adrenaline rush he'd felt when he pressed that silent alert button had given way to a dull ache of uncertainty. What if it did nothing? What if the control center dismissed his call as a prank, or worse, a mistake? He closed his eyes and pictured the illuminated console in Paris, the little red dot blinking for attention. He had no way of knowing if anyone was even looking. Beside him, Diana quietly unwrapped the last of her in-flight snack and offered him half. He shook his head. He couldn't swallow another bite. Food tasted like ash in his mouth. His stomach roiled, a physical echo of the turmoil in his chest. He remembered the first night he'd stayed at his grandfather's lake house upstate. He'd woken early, tiptoed down creaking wooden stairs, and found his grandfather sipping coffee in the study. The old man had looked up, smiled, and said, "You ever doubt yourself, X? Come find me." He'd guided Xavier through a breathing exercise that made the world slow down just long enough to feel his own center. Xavier tried to summon that memory now. He closed his eyes and inhaled, counting to 5, then exhaled just as slowly. But instead of calm, his chest tightened. He felt hollow, as though the space where confidence belonged was empty. He opened his eyes and looked around. Passengers reclined in their seats, reading magazines or scrolling through streaming catalogs. Some couples whispered to each other, their heads inclined in conspiratorial comfort. A toddler across the aisle babbled, and a mother shushed him with apologetic eyes. No one was looking at him, not really. They'd watched the drama unfold, sure, but now that the cabin doors had closed on it, they'd retreated into their own little worlds. He felt the weight of being unmoored from first class, from the place he'd earned with hard-saved allowance and careful budgeting of his summer internships. In the pocket in front of him, the safety card lay untouched, an ironic symbol of rules no one had told him applied to people like him. He reached down, tugged it out, and flipped it open. The illustrations of seat belts and oxygen masks made him bitterly aware of the life jacket of privilege he wore, yet couldn't inflate when he needed it most. A gentle chime announced beverage service. A flight attendant glided into view and offered him boxed juice. He accepted it automatically and sipped tentatively, the sweet, cool liquid barely registering. His eyes flicked to Diana. She gave him a sympathetic look, her eyebrows drawn together as if she wanted to say something else, but didn't. Finally, he spoke. "Diana," he whispered, "I feel stuck." She leaned in, lowering her tone. "I know, but you did what you had to do." He shook his head. "I don't know if it was enough. I don't even know if anyone's going to do anything about it." She reached for his hand, but hesitated. "That signal you sent, it's not about you needing them to fight your fight. It's about making sure someone knew what happened." He let her words settle. "But right now I feel like I'm the only one who remembered." Behind him, a flight attendant brushed past, stacking service trays. He wanted to call out, "Notice me," but that would only reinforce Greta's excuse that he was causing disruption. He closed his eyes again, trying to find the steady center his grandfather had taught him to seek. A memory drifted in. A lazy Sunday afternoon in Central Park, his grandmother reading poetry while he sat cross-legged at her feet. She'd recited Langston Hughes, "Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is a broken-winged bird that cannot fly." He'd never felt those words more keenly. His dream hadn't died, but it had been slapped back to earth. The engines hummed steadily as the captain's voice floated over the intercom. "We'll be cruising at 34,000 feet. We appreciate your patience during the delay." Delay. The word felt hollow. The flight wasn't just delayed. It had been hijacked by prejudice. Every second he sat here was a reminder that his dignity had been dismissed. He looked at the overhead bin latch, then back at his untouched sandwich. He toyed with the idea of tearing up his boarding pass, relinquishing the last proof that he belonged here. But he couldn't. That ticket was more than paper. It was his right. And however powerless he felt now, he knew rights couldn't be torn away by prejudice any more than a book could be erased by a glare. He tapped out a quick message to his father, "Ticket honored." It was all he wrote. No punctuation, no emotion, just the bare fact he longed for. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned his head against the seat back. The cabin lights shifted to night mode, a soft blue wash that felt more somber than soothing. He closed his eyes and let the vibration of the plane's engines lull him. In that darkness, he could almost feel the world pump. The moment when the silent alert would trigger response. He visualized an operator in the control center tapping a console, eyes widening as the CCTV feed blinked to life inside the cabin. He imagined the high-definition screen by seat 1A flicking on, revealing the stark reality of Greta's hand connecting with his wrist. And in that image, one that only he could not see, he placed his hope. Because hope, he remembered, was the thing that kept a bird aloft. Even if the moment felt still, even if the cabin sat in complicit quiet, the true movement was happening somewhere else. On a screen, in a control room, in the minds of people who would no longer look away. Xavier exhaled one last time, letting the tension seep out. He fit his armrest back into place and straightened his spine. The flight attendants dimmed the cabin completely, and a hush descended. For the first time since stepping aboard, he let himself rest, not because the storm was over, but because he trusted that the alert he'd sent would speak when he could not. And in that fragile trust, he found a quiet strength he'd never known before. Xavier sat forward, heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin lights had settled into a muted glow, and passengers around him were dozing or scrolling through in-flight entertainment. No one suspected the quiet resonance of a single action tucked inside Xavier's pocket would soon ripple through the jet stream. He slipped his hand into his jacket and felt the smooth contour of his phone. The silent alert icon blinked faintly. A small rectangle of light in the darkness. It was designed for emergencies, hijack warnings, medical crises, security breaches. Today, Xavier would stretch its purpose to include prejudice. His thumb hovered over the icon. He thought of Greta Svensson's gloved hand, how it had struck him with that sharp crack. He thought of every face that had averted its gaze, choosing convenience over conscience. In that moment, he realized silence was complicity, and he would refuse to be complicit. He tapped the icon. Instantly, a hush seemed to descend even deeper over the cabin. Xavier's breath hitched. He stared at the screen as text scrolled, "Silent alert. Seat 1A incident. Slap. Verify and action required." He watched the confirmation pop up. Message sent to Paris Control Center, awaiting acknowledgement. He tucked the phone away, exhaling slowly. The weight in his chest shifted from anxious dread to cautious anticipation. Whatever happened next would occur far from these seats, but its power would radiate straight back here. At 34,000 feet, the jet hummed like a great silver whale drifting through clouds. Xavier closed his eyes and pictured the control room at Charles de Gaulle. Banked monitors, the soft glow of data streams, operators leaning forward as alerts came in. He imagined the red flag blinking, Seat 1A highlighted in bold. Back in the cabin, the seatbelt sign pinged off, and a flight attendant began distributing newspapers. Xavier didn't reach for one. He leaned back and reflected on what he'd done. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a confrontation. It was a quiet assertion. This cannot stand. He thought of his grandfather's stories, how decades ago a single pilot's letter had forced an airline to rewrite its policies. That letter had been penned in ink. Xavier's alert was written in code, different medium, same intent, to demand accountability. Across the aisle, Diana Green caught his eye. She raised a brow in question. He nodded once. She didn't ask for detail. She simply offered a small, respectful smile. Solidarity in silence. Xavier allowed himself a moment of calm as he watched the cabin routine unfold. The engines softened into cruise mode, and the meal service began. The trolley clattered down the aisle, and Xavier accepted a glass of water without thinking. He sipped it, feeling the cold liquid steady him. Behind the curtain, he heard muffled voices. Greta's clipped tones, the rustle of paper, a junior flight attendant's uncertain question, but no one addressed him directly. They were operating on the assumption that his seat had already been surrendered. Soon, that assumption would be shattered. He turned his attention back to the window. Streaks of sky blue clouds slid past below the wing. He rested his forehead against the cool glass, closed his eyes, and let the memory of Paris settle in. The bustling terminals, the aroma of fresh croissants in the cafe near the gate. In a few minutes, control room personnel there would taste that same hush of anticipation. In the virtual control center, an alert had popped up on operator line 3. Antoine Lefebvre, whose shift began at dawn, paused his coffee and tapped the notification. The message read, "Silent alert from Flight 672. possible security policy incident in first class. Antoine frowned. He knew the drill. Any cooked yellow alert meant immediate action. He forwarded the message to his supervisor and brought up the CCTV feed for seat 1A. Within seconds, the on-screen image in the cabin flickered. Greta Svensson's uniform, Xavier's dark hoodie, capturing the slap in stark detail. Back in business class, Xavier shifted in his seat, unaware of the video feed springing to life half a continent away. Antoine's supervisor, Madame Durand, a veteran of airline security, watched the footage. She saw the slap, then Xavier's stunned expression, the way he acquiesced and moved to business class. She muttered, "Impossible. Proceed with hold protocol." Attendant tapped the hold departure button. Instantly, the system blocked all takeoff clearances for Flight 672. A digital red banner slashed across the screen. Flight 672. Hold at gate. Authorize crew response. Security incident. Now the alert rippled out to every console. Captain's display, cabin crew comms, ground control. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Hammond felt his headset buzz. He glanced at the message, "Hold flight." His jaw tightened. He hated unexplained holds. He dialed the crew and connected to the galley. "Greta, report to the cockpit," he said without greeting. In the cabin, Xavier noticed a shift. Lights dimmed and brightened. Instruments clicked. He looked up as the overhead panel's indicators danced. Hold, bean, bus. A stewardess paused by his row, her eyes apologetic yet resigned. Captain Hammond's silhouette appeared in the curtain slit. "Miss Svensson," he called, "please join us." Greta froze, the first real tremor of distress crossing her composed features. Any illusion of control she'd held was slipping. Xavier sat straighter. Even if he didn't fully understand what was unfolding, he felt the tide turning. He reached for his book. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, not to read, but as an anchor. The evening sun slanted through the window, gilding the pages. He allowed the warmth to settle his resolve. Madame Durand's voice crackled over the internal comms. "Crew, acknowledge hold protocol Class A. Proceed with passenger notification." A stewardess activated the PEA. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. Please remain seated. We are addressing an urgent security matter." Murmurs spread instantly. Xavier heard hushed, "What's wrong? Did someone fall ill? Are we being hijacked?" He did not correct them. Let them wonder. Let them grapple with their own assumptions. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back. This was the moment he'd been building toward, a silent signal transformed into an undeniable command that would force a reckoning. In the dim cabin, Xavier felt a quiet satisfaction. He had not raised his voice. He had not demanded loud apologies. He'd simply refused to remain invisible. Somewhere beyond these walls of aluminum and plastic, a control room in Paris was rippling with activity. Soon, an official message would flow back. Incident verified. Crew to return passenger to seat 1A with formal apology. Xavier steadied himself, reflecting on the power of a single code, a silent assertion of truth. The engines idled in expectancy. Outside, the runway lights stretched ahead like lighthouses. Xavier touched his ticket again, imagining it in his grandfather's pay, imagining the pride his ancestors would feel. His journey wasn't just about a seat. It was about every boy who'd ever been told he didn't belong, every girl who'd ever been shushed by authority. The world had paused for him, and now it was listening. And Xavier, 15 years old, sat in the quiet before the storm, ready for what came next. Xavier hadn't even glanced at the screen above seat 1A until it flickered on, bathing the cabin in an unexpected glow. Business class lights dimmed further, pulling every passenger's gaze upward. In the gentle hum of cruise, the flicker sounded like a heartbeat slowing, an invitation to lean in. Then the image sharpened. At first, no one spoke. The high-definition feed showed Greta Svensson's gloved hand ringing through the air toward Xavier's wrist. The moment before contact, the instant of impact, the stunned ripple across his face, and then the slow close-up on her expression. Icy surprise quickly masked by rigid composure. A collective intake of breath rolled through the cabin. Glasses paused mid-lift. A newspaper rustled. A man's shoe tapped the floor. Xavier felt it too. The weight of 1,000 eyes, all witnessing what he had endured. Yet his posture remained calm, unbowed. He sat straight, chin level, as though he were watching someone else. The screen cut to black for a fraction of a second, then returned, rewound, replayed in slow motion. Seatback speakers crackled. Playback initiated for incident review. No explanations, no apologies, just the raw footage, undeniable. A hush folded over the cabin, thicker than any engine roar. The first-class curtain trembled at the seam as Greta appeared at its edge, her face drained of color. She took a tentative step forward, but the footage played on, repeating the crack of the slap, the echo of privilege colliding with prejudice. A gray-haired banker in Tusi swallowed audibly. He hadn't spoken when the slap happened. Now his throat seemed to tighten. 2 rows back, a retired school teacher clutched her pearls as though they would anchor her to righteousness. Even the toddler's giggle from business class died. Xavier watched each passenger's reaction through the corner of his eye. Shock, regret, embarrassment. Some placed a hand over their mouths. Others looked away, unable to unsee. A middle-aged woman dabbed at her eye with a napkin, as if tears had welled from witnessing a cruelty she'd long ignored. He rested his hands on the armrests. His chest was calm, his mind clear. He recalled how his grandfather once told him, "Justice isn't what happens in public. It's what you force into the open." Here it was on loop for all to judge. The screen switched to a split view. Xavier's composed profile on one side, Greta's taut features on the other. Subtitle in bold red letters appeared, reviewing improper conduct. At that command, the cockpit door slid open and Captain Richard Hammond's silhouette filled the doorway. He didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just watched the screen for a long moment. Then he turned and strode past Greta, who followed, shoulders hunched. In the sudden stillness, Xavier felt a shift in the cabin's gravity. The crew's authority had been unmasked as fragile. The clear line between staff and passenger now wavered under the harsh light of truth. Diana leaned across the aisle and whispered, "You're doing great." He nodded, though his heart fluttered at the rush of vindication. He pictured the control center operators in Paris, receiving the silent alert, marshalling the playback, green-lighting the broadcast in an instant. A simple tap on his phone had ignited a public reckoning. A senior flight attendant in first class stepped forward, her name in red Avery books. She pressed her collar mic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your senior crew member speaking. You have just witnessed footage of unacceptable conduct by our head flight attendant. We apologize deeply for this incident. We are now taking immediate steps to address it." Her voice was calm and sorrowful in equal measure, just the tone Xavier would have chosen had he dared speak up in that moment. Greta reappeared from the cockpit, flanked by Captain Hammond. She paused at the front row, gaze locked on the screen, then slowly turned to face the passengers. Xavier watched her lips tremble. She swallowed. I want to apologize to Mr. Marshall," she said, voice quavering. "My actions were wrong, and I'm sorry for what I did." A murmur rippled through first class. Some nodded, some crossed their arms, some simply stared. Xavier's heart thumped as the crew ushered Greta to stand beside him. For the first time, she had to look directly at the boy she dismissed. No curtain to hide behind. He locked eyes with her for a moment, then looked down at his hands folded in his lap. He didn't speak. He let his silence speak for him. Dignity, unbroken. The cabin held its breath. Avery's voice returned. "Mr. Marshall, you are welcome to return to your seat." The IFE screens blinked off, and the cabin lights gradually brightened. Xavier rose. With steady steps, he walked past the empty aisle seats, each one a testament to assumptions shattered. He passed the banking executive who offered a small, "I'm sorry." He passed rows of bowed heads and integrated reflex in smart glasses. Everyone forced to confront their own complicity. When he reached seat 1A, he paused. He turned back, saw Greta looking down at her polished shoes. He met her gaze one last no anger, just the calm knowledge that truth had prevailed. Then he slid into the seat, buckled his belt, and opened his book. He didn't need words. The cabin had already spoken. And in that shared silence, Xavier felt a quiet triumph greater than applause, a reckoning brought to light, a moment of justice, served with nothing but a single silent signal and a replayed image that could no longer be ignored. Xavier settled back into 1A, the leather cool against his palms, but his pulse still thrummed with that electric mix of vindication and anticipation. The cabin lights bloomed back to their normal glow, but a new hush had fallen, one born not of tension, but of collective awareness. From the cockpit curtain, Captain Richard Hammond re-emerged, flanked by two figures Xavier recognized only by their uniforms, one sharply dressed in the airline's executive livery, the other clutching a tablet covered in scribbled notes. The executive cleared his throat into the cabin's PA system, his voice calm but authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pausing as every eye in first class refocused on him. "Thank you for your patience. I am David Harper, Chief Operating Officer of this airline. We've reviewed the incident at seat 1A and determined that an immediate public apology is required." Greta Svensson's shoulders dropped as the words hung in the air. Xavier saw her fingers twitch at her sides. She did not speak. Harper continued, "We will not proceed with our flight until Mr. Marshall is reinstated to his rightful seat and the crew member responsible has addressed her misconduct directly to him and to all of you here. We understand the gravity of this situation, and we are committed to ensuring respect and dignity for every passenger. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged astonished glances. Others closed their mouths, wide-eyed. The couple in 1C leaned close, whispering fervently. The banker in 2D touched his lapel as if steadying his own composure. Even the toddler in business seemed to hush mid-whimper, as though catching the adult tension. Xavier's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a rush of something like pride. He had not imagined this moment in detail, had not known exactly how the airline hierarchy would respond. But here was the unmistakable proof. A CEO-level executive, his voice resonating through the cabin's hidden speakers, enforcing justice on the spot. Captain Hammond cleared his throat. "Miss Vinson," he prompted gently. Greta finally drew in a breath, stepping forward into the aisle's clear strip of light. She paused, gathering herself. Xavier could see the sheen of moisture at the corner of her eye, the small tremor in her cheek. She raised one hand as though to still a throng of voices in her mind. Then she spoke, her voice low but carrying through the cabin. "Mr. Marshall, Ms. Green, and everyone here assembled, She faltered, then steadied. "I apologize for my actions. I acted on personal bias, not procedure. I am sorry." Her words echoed in the cabin, filling every empty space the slap had left behind. A breath collective as the sea exhaled seemed to sweep through the rows. Some passengers sat straighter. Several nodded as if affirming her admission. The silver-haired banker placed his forehead against his fist, eyes closed. The woman with the floral scarf dabbed at her cheeks. It wasn't a triumphant cheer. It was a quiet acknowledgement that wrong had been righted. Xavier watched her no more than a few seconds, stayed unmoved by any impulse to gloat. His victory lay in quieter terms, in seeing protocol restored, dignity returned. He inclined his head once, his silent acknowledgement that her apology had been heard. Harper stepped forward, lifting a hand. "Thank you, Miss Vinson," he said. "Mr. Marshall, you are cleared to resume your seat." A steward gently guided Greta back to the galley, where she would remain off-duty for the duration of this flight. Xavier rose and smoothed his jacket. He passed the silent faces of his fellow passengers. Each one had borne witness to this reckoning. The banker offered a small, respectful nod as Xavier passed. The young couple whispered "thank you" under their breath. Even the toddler pointed, perhaps noting the change in the air. Seated back in 1A, Xavier buckled his belt. He placed his boarding pass on the armrest and opened his book. But his eyes didn't track the lines on the page. Instead, he watched the cabin transform back into its usual rhythm. Attendants folding napkins, trays being cleared, idle conversations resuming, but now under the weight of what had just happened. Diana slid into the aisle seat across from him, offering a soft smile. "You did it," she whispered. He gave a small nod, voice low. "We did it." The hum of the engine swelled, and the seatbelt sign pinged on, reminding everyone to return their seats upright. Xavier felt the gentle vibration of movement, taxing perhaps, then soon liftoff. The world outside would change little. Clouds, sky, runway lights. But inside this cabin, something fundamental had shifted. He thought of his grandfather's stories again. How one letter forced policy change. How one pilot's petition reshaped protocols. Today, it had been one signal, one broadcast image, one apology delivered under public scrutiny that had rewritten the narrative. A steward approached with a tray of post-apology refreshments, champagne for first class, sparkling water for business. Xavier took a glass of Perrier Jouet, the bubbles rising like tiny victories. He sipped slowly, savoring the moment's stillness. He glanced around once more, faces no longer averted, but engaged. People reflecting perhaps on where they'd stood when the slap first fell. He imagined them carrying this moment beyond the cabin, into conversations at dinner tables, into memories stored away for days, when they needed to remember what it felt like to witness both wrong and justice. Above him, the wingtip rose on a curve against the sky. The cabin lights dimmed once more for takeoff final checks. Xavier leaned back, glass in hand, and exhaled. The rush of events had receded, leaving a quiet clarity. He opened his book at the crease, thumb marking the page where the story had paused. He didn't read. Instead, he traced a finger along the spine, a silent gesture of gratitude to every person who dared to look, to believe, to stint, even if that stint had been made in silence. The engines roared as they accelerated down the runway. Xavier sat unmoved by the motion, grounded by the knowledge that true altitude is found not just in the sky, but in standing up for what's right, even when no one else seems willing to do so. And as the plane lifted off, carrying them toward New York, Xavier Marshall closed his eyes and felt the cabin's collective heart beat with him, in unison, awake and forever changed. Xavier felt the tension peak in the cabin like the moment before. A storm breaks. Every conversation, every rustle of a seatbelt seemed to hush as first-class swimmers in silk scarves and tailored suits turned their attention forward. The replayed footage had done its work. Greta Svensson's hand, pressing into his wrist, was now an unmistakable, looping indictment of her judgment. And now at the climax, the system's highest authority was about to demand the final act of reckoning. Captain Richard Hammond stood in the aisle beside Xavier's seat. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes held a solemn gravity. He raised a hand, signaling silence, and spoke with a crisp authority that left no room for debate. "Miss Svensson, please step forward and make your apology to Mr. Marshall and to all of our passengers." Greta's face was ashen. She rose stiffly from her place in the galley, where she'd been waiting under informal suspension, and stepped into the aisle. Each footfall echoed against the carpeting, a metronome counting out her fall from grace. Her uniform jacket was buttoned neatly, but her composure trembled. She paused directly across from Xavier. He looked up at her, calm and still, as though he were watching the tide turn. In that silent exchange, he forgave her a fraction of the moment he'd been spat upon by implied prejudice. Greta began, voice quivering. She cleared her throat, squared her shoulders, and let the apology flow. "I want to apologize to you, Mr. Marshall," she said, her voice louder now that the cabin hung on every word. "What I did was wrong. I acted on bias, not on any professional protocol. I'm deeply sorry for slapping you and for how I treated you." Around them, passengers shifted, drawn forward by the vulnerability in her confession. A well-dressed executive behind them whispered, "Finally." A flight attendant in the background dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. The toddler in business class watched, head tilted, sensing the gravity more fully than many adults. Greta swallowed and took a breath. "I asked you to move without verifying your valid fare. I let my assumptions override respect. You have every right to be here. I'm sorry." Her voice wavered, but it held conviction. Xavier watched her, silent but not unmoved. He could see the tears brimming in her eyes, the tremor in her hands. He understood it wasn't easy, for no one is eager to admit wrongdoing in front of an audience that had already judged you. But this was the moment when authority bowed to accountability. He cleared his throat. His voice rang out, soft even, but carrying through the cabin like a paddle against still water. "Thank you, Miss Svensson," he said. "I sit here because I deserve to. not because of my name or my family's wealth, but because I followed the rules. You assumed I didn't belong before you verified. I won't do the same." His words landed with measured weight. There was no triumph in his tone. He lay quiet assertion of his right. Passengers exhaled as though a breath had been held too long. Soft nods rippled through the rows, heads inclined in acknowledgement. Greta's shoulders slumped, and for a moment she seemed smaller than the neatly starched uniform she wore. But beneath that humiliation lay a hard-earned lesson. She met Xavier's gaze again, as though seeking absolution for herself, as well as restitution for him. Captain Hammond stepped forward, pressing a button on his lapel mic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "Mr. Marshall has returned to seat 1A. We will now resume our flight. Thank you for your patience and understanding." A steward guided Greta back to the galley, where she would remain off duty. The crew moved to reset the cabin, napkins refolded, glasses replaced. But the air felt changed, renewed by justice served in the open. Xavier sank back into his seat. He buckled his belt again, thumb brushing the leather, as if sealing the moment into memory. The tray table clicked down, and he placed his boarding pass on the armrest. Proof that rights, once demanded respectfully, could no longer be denied. He reopened his book. Achebe's Things Fall Apart. But this time the words on the page felt like background music to the real story that had just unfolded. Around him, conversation resumed in quieter tones, huddles of people sharing impressions. "Did you see the replay?" "I couldn't believe it." "Good on him." Diana slipped back into her seat beside him and laid a hand on his arm. "That was incredible," she whispered. He offered her a small smile. "It wasn't about being incredible. It was about being heard." She nodded. "You made them all listen." Xavier looked out the window as the runway lights streaked past. Outside, the world was the same endless sky. Inside, everything had shifted. For the rest of the flight, the cabin would hum with a deeper awareness that empathy requires action, that silence can be weaponized or wielded for justice, depending on whose voice holds the volume. As the captain's voice returned for takeoff clearance, Xavier felt a calm certainty settle in his chest. He had claim to this seat, this cabin, and beyond. But more importantly, he'd claimed the right to dignity for anyone who looked like him and ever felt they didn't belong. The plane lifted, and the cabin's routine soundscape returned. Seatbelts unfastening, overhead bins clicking open, luggage pulled free. But Xavier remained seated for a heartbeat longer, letting the triumph of quiet victory wash over him. Because sometimes the greatest impact comes not from a shout, but from a truth spoken softly and heard by everyone. The cabin's energy shifted as phones emerged from pockets and purses. A passenger in 3B tapped rapidly at his screen. Another leaned over to whisper, "It's all over Twitter." Within minutes, a 10-second clip of that slap and the replayed apology had racked up thousands of views under hashtags like Seat 1A and Silent Alert. In first class, champagne service paused mid-pour. The executive team assembled in the galley, huddled over tablets displaying real-time metrics. Brand mentions skyrocketing, negative sentiment swinging above 75%. And the urgent volume of "What's the airline doing?" notifications flooding in. David Harper's jaw tightened as he watched the analytics climb. This wasn't just a PR hiccup, it was a full-blown crisis. Meanwhile, in a sleek conference room at the airline's Paris headquarters, an emergency video call convened. Harper appeared on screen beside Marcus Walker, the airline's majority shareholder. Marcus's expression was measured. He'd engineered the response, but now faced the fallout. "We need a comprehensive internal review," Marcus said, voice low yet firm, no token gestures. Back on board, Xavier closed his book around page 1 to 12 and leaned back. He watched flight attendants whisper to one another, resetting service stations. He detected something different in their demeanors. A new respect, a cautious pride. Business class passengers in rows 12-18 swapped knowing glances. They had been silent witnesses, but now bore witness to real change. As the flight finally lifted toward New York, a hush settled again. This time, not of tension, but of collective reflection. Xavier tapped his boarding pass against the armrest, a small private victory. Above the engine's steady roar, he imagined the social media storm growing, discussions about prejudice, policies rewritten, voices amplified. He didn't need to watch the numbers climb. He'd already felt the impact. And somewhere beyond the cabin's walls, the airline was waking up to a new standard of accountability, one that Xavier had quietly, powerfully set into motion. As the cabin lights returned to their normal glow, Xavier sat quietly in 1A, surrounded by the soft bustle of resumed service. The noise of clinking silverware and hushed conversations felt different now, infused with an unspoken awareness. He glanced around. A couple in C shared a meaningful look. A woman in 3A folded her newspaper with deliberate care, and a young mother in business gently squeezed her child's hand as she passed by. He closed his book and looked out the window at the pale blanket of clouds. In the distance, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. It struck him how fleeting light could be, how moments of darkness can be just as brief if you refuse to stay swallowed by them. Diana reappeared at the curtain, carrying 2 cups of tea. She slid into the seat beside him. "Thought you might want something warm," she said softly. He accepted the steaming cup and inhaled its familiar, comforting scent. "Thank you," he replied. He lifted the cup in a small toast, more to himself than anyone, "for seeing me." She smiled. "You let everyone else see too." He nodded. "That's what matters." He placed the cup on the tray table and rested his palms on his knees. "I think they'll remember this flight." She leaned back, thoughtful, more than any destination. In that moment, Xavier felt a quiet breeze well inside him. Not pride born of arrogance, but pride like a sturdy oak, rooted in integrity and grown from standing firm. Around them, flight attendants began collecting empty cups, their courtesy now delivered with genuine warmth rather than routine. Xavier took one last look at his fellow passengers. The banker met his gaze with the retired teacher whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. Even the toddler moaned in a shock wave. He raised his cup again softly. "To dignity," he said. And in the hum of the cabin, amid the soft clatter of service carts and the steady drone of the engines, that simple affirmation echoed. Dignity reclaimed, justice witnessed, and a flight transformed from a journey of prejudice to one of profound awareness. As the wheels of Flight 62 finally kissed the runway in New York, Xavier remained seated in 1A, hands folded calmly in his lap. Round him, passengers stirred gently, captain pits to jot thoughts, exchanging hushed reflections, capturing one last silent moment before the cabin emptied. A small camera crew, arranged at Marcus Walker's discreet request, recorded a brief live statement. Xavier stood, his figure backlit by the open doorway behind him. He looked directly into the lens, voice steady and warm. "Hello," he began. "I am Xavier Marshall. Today I sat in the seat I'd earned, and I spoke without shouting. We often think silence means ignorance, but silence can also demand attention. Each of us has a moment when we choose to stand up or to look away. Today, I chose to use a silent signal to say, 'This isn't right.'" He paused, letting the words settle. The cabin behind him was nearly empty, rows of empty seats like quiet witnesses. I don't need to be a billionaire's son to ask for respect, he continued. And you don't need wealth to speak up for what's fair. When we see someone treated unfairly, our silence becomes their cage. He offered a small, genuine smile. If this story means anything to you, share it. Talk about it with your friends, your family, because every conversation can spark change. Leave a comment. Tell me when you felt the power of silence, when you wished you'd spoken up. And if you believe in fairness as much as I do, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Let's keep building a community that refuses to look away. He stepped back, and the camera cut to a wide shot of the empty cabin, now flooded with late afternoon sunlight. A final whistle from Diana. It took one silent signal to shift an entire flight. Imagine what we could do together. The screen faded to black with a simple on-screen message. Did you witness justice and choose silence? Or did you dare to speak up? Share below. And as the last credits rolled, Flight 62's story became more than a journey between cities. It became a journey toward awareness, one click at a time.